All right, so welcome to the deep dive. And today, we're going to be digging into something pretty fundamental. Why do corporations ever act in socially responsible ways?
Yeah,
Like with all the talk about profits, right?
it's a good question. It's a really good question.
It is. We've got this academic paper to help us out called Why Would Corporations Behave in Socially Responsible Ways? An Institutional Theory of Corporate Social Responsibility.
Bit of a mouthful, but
Yeah.
gets to the heart of things.
It really does, yeah. A lot of times the assumption is, if you just look at kind of basic economics, companies just want to maximize profit.
Right.
But this paper gives you this much broader perspective by looking at all these sort of institutional factors that can actually push corporations towards being more responsible. It goes way beyond just like individual ethics or even whether it immediately helps their bottom line. So when we talk about these institutional forces, what do we mean? I mean, the paper mentions government regulations, industry rules, organizations that are kind of keeping an eye on things, social norms, even how companies interact with each other
Yeah.
and all their stakeholders. It's like a whole ecosystem, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it starts off, acknowledging that core idea in economic thinking. The corporations, they're primarily driven by profit and shareholder value. If a company thinks they can get away with, cutting corners or whatever to boost profits, that's kind of the predicted behavior.
Right.
It's this baseline assumption from, fields like economic regulation, which often looks at companies as like purely self-interested actors focused on minimizing costs.
Right, right.
But this paper is saying, hang on a second, that might not be the whole story.
Yeah, because we know, just from looking around, that a lot of companies do act responsibly, at least some of the time. So what flips that switch?
Yeah.
When are they more likely to actually take these socially responsible actions?
Well, it does touch on the role of economics, right?
Right.
I mean, a company that's struggling financially might have less leeway to pursue social initiative.
Less resources to devote to that.
Exactly. But I think for me, what's really fascinating is the role of competition. It's not just like more competition equals less responsibility. It's more nuanced than that.
Right. Because the paper actually suggests that too much competition can almost have the opposite effect. It puts companies in survival mode,
Yeah.
and social concerns can get pushed aside.
Exactly.
But then on the other hand, what about situations where there's hardly any competition?
Well, then, there's less incentive to worry about your public image.
Right.
But what the paper highlights is that this sort of sweet spot of moderate competition actually can encourage companies to be more responsible. It becomes a way to stand out, to build a good reputation that attracts customers and investors.
That's interesting. So competition itself can be a motivating factor in some ways.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about something a little more concrete. Regulations. The paper makes a pretty strong case that strong government regulations, the kind that are actually enforced, can be a huge driver of corporate responsibility. What makes them so effective?
Well, especially when those regulations are developed in a way that involves all the different stakeholders, not just the government dictating terms, but actually having conversations with industry, with workers, with communities.
Right.
Think about the historical improvements we've seen in areas like food safety. When you have well-designed and well-enforced rules, it creates this kind of level playing field and a clear expectation for companies to follow. And ultimately, that benefits everyone.
Right.
The paper also talks about what happens when regulations are loosened, and it suggests there can be real downsides for responsible behavior. So that's something to consider too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes sense. I mean, if companies know there are going to be consequences for bad behavior, they're more likely to play by the rules. But the paper doesn't just stop at government regulations. It also talks about industries creating their own rules.
Self-regulation.
Yeah, self-regulation.
Yeah, that's right.
How effective can that be?
It can be really effective, especially when it's driven by the threat of government intervention. If companies feel like the government's going to step in and impose stricter rules, they might be more willing to get their act together and regulate themselves.
Right.
Or sometimes it happens after some kind of crisis within an industry. And it's interesting, the paper points out that state support for these self-regulatory efforts is often really important.
Oh, that's interesting.
You see examples like, dairy cooperatives establishing quality standards, or the nuclear industry, enhancing their safety protocols after some major incident.
Oh, so it's almost like a partnership in a way. Okay, so we've got the top-down pressure from government, we've got the sort of internal pressure from within industries, but there's also pressure from the outside.
Right.
Right? The paper really emphasizes the role of these monitoring organizations.
Yeah.
Who are we talking about here, and how do they influence things?
So these are the watchdogs, right? They're the ones who are out there keeping an eye on what corporations are doing. You've got your NGOs, social movements, institutional investors, even the press. They're all shining a spotlight on corporate actions, and that can create a lot of pressure for greater responsibility.
Right. Right.
Think about, the campaigns you see from NGOs targeting specific practices like, unsustainable palm oil sourcing or working conditions in factories. Or, you see shareholder activism pushing companies to be more transparent about their environmental and social impacts. These are all really powerful examples of how monitoring organizations can drive change.
And those are things that we see all the time. I mean, it's almost constant now.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. Okay, so beyond all those more formal rules and external pressures, the paper digs into this other level, which is, the less tangible but equally powerful, maybe even more powerful in some ways.
Yeah.
Influence of social norms within the business world.
Mm-hmm.
How do these norms actually shape what's considered acceptable behavior?
Yeah.
It's not written down, right? It's not a law, it's not a regulation, but...
No, it's this sort of unwritten code, right?
Yeah.
It's these institutionalized norms that are spread through, influential business publications, the things that executives and managers are reading,
Right.
business school curricula, what are the up-and-coming business leaders learning?
Right.
This all shapes their understanding of what's appropriate behavior, and it creates this kind of peer pressure.
Yeah.
If everyone else in your industry is doing something a certain way, it's harder to stand out and do things differently. And it can influence decisions even when there aren't strict legal requirements in place.
Interesting. So, we've talked about companies acting alone, responding to government pressure, responding to pressure from within their industries, responding to pressure from NGOs and activists. But the paper also talks about this other angle, which is corporate associations.
Right. Trade groups and such.
Yeah. Can joining one of those actually make a company more likely to behave responsibly?
It has the potential to, but the paper really emphasizes that it depends a lot on the association itself.
Oh.
If the association is actively promoting social responsibility amongst its members, educating them on best practices, fostering that sense of collective accountability, then yeah, it can have a real impact. But if an association is kind of resistant to those efforts, then probably not so much.
Interesting. So it really depends on the culture of the association itself.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then finally, the paper looks at the impact of something that seems really direct, which is just stakeholder dialogue.
Yeah.
Actually talking to unions, employees, community groups, investors, and so on.
Right.
How can that lead to more responsible actions? It seems so simple.
It's powerful, though, right? Because when corporations are actually genuinely engaging in these conversations, listening to what their stakeholders have to say, it can really broaden their understanding of those concerns and potentially even shift their priorities.
Okay.
The paper talks about the German system of worker representation on company boards.
Right.
That's a really interesting example where workers actually have a formal voice in decision-making.
Yeah.
You see other examples, too, like, companies setting environmental targets in collaboration with local communities.
Right.
So it's not just about, companies dictating terms. It's about actually working together with stakeholders to come up with solutions that benefit everyone.
So what we're seeing here is that corporate social responsibility isn't just about individual companies deciding to be good. It's actually embedded in this whole web of relationships and pressures and expectations.
Exactly. While a company's financial health is certainly a factor, the paper makes a really compelling case that the strength and the nature of these institutional forces are what ultimately determines whether corporations consistently choose socially responsible paths.
So thinking about, the world today, so interconnected,
Yeah.
it really makes you think about how these forces are playing out on a global scale.
Yeah.
Are they robust enough? Are there places where things need to be strengthened? Lots to think about. Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive. This was fascinating.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I always learn something new.
It's a complex issue for sure, but an important one.
Absolutely. And we'll see you next time on the deep dive.